We're in the starting to wind down our series that we've been looking at called Aha. Just to kind of back up and recap what we've talked about so far. We've talked about how it's not a question of if we leave the Father's house, it's a question of when we leave the Father's house. In other words, at some point in our lives, we are going to purposely or unconsciously walk away from the Father at some point. And that when we do that, we find ourselves in the distant country. We find ourselves far away from God. We find ourselves in a distant foreign land. And that there are three ingredients to an aha moment. And we've talked about two of those leading up to today. The two that we've talked about, first of all, that Phil talked to you about a couple of weeks ago, is a sudden awakening. You wake up and you realize, man, I'm not home anymore. And then last week we talked about the idea of brutal honesty. That when we wake up, when we realize that we're not at the Father's house anymore, that we're in the distant country, it's not enough just to wake up, that we have to be honest about it to ourselves, about how we got there. I have sinned. It's not somebody else's fault. I sinned. So that leads us up to where we're at today. And I want to start out with the question. Have you ever seen a problem either in yourself or in someone around you or in the world in general? You see a problem, you know something needs to be done, and you think to yourself, maybe somebody ought to do something about that. You don't think maybe I should do something about it. It's, maybe somebody ought to do something about that. Have you ever had that question? Have you ever had that issue? I know I have on many occasions. As I was thinking through this, I remember a few years ago, Kelly and I were at a week of church camp in New Mexico, and it was teenagers. It was junior and senior high combined, and we had about between 30 and 40 teens at this camp. And the camp is very rugged. It's up in the middle of the mountains in New Mexico. It's desert. There's not a lot of things around the camp to do. It's hard to keep it clean because there's dust and dirt and lizards running everywhere. But I remember distinctly watching the kids that week, and there was never a mess made that somebody just stepped over and left. I was very impressed, actually. I was very surprised that those teenagers kept that camp cleaned up. They never once said, somebody else will take care of it and walk away from something when they saw something. And I was shocked. I couldn't believe it because I've seen adults step over messes and leave it before. A lot of times we have to remind people, your mom doesn't work here, clean up your own stuff, right? But I know that we've all experienced that. I know we've had those moments in our lives where we see a problem and think, somebody ought to do something, but it never dawns on us that maybe we're the person that needs to do it. In fact, Matthew West has a song about that very thing. So, God, why don't you do something about this? And his response in the song is, I did. I created you. There was a story that I told a few months ago in our Life on Mission series, but it relates really well with what we're talking about here. Tim Harlow tells the story of an author friend of his that's sitting at her desk writing one day, and she looks out and sees a streak of yellow flash across her backyard. And she can't figure out what's going on for a second until she realizes that there is a skunk running around her backyard with a yellow yogurt container stuck on its head. And she thinks, somebody ought to go help that skunk. And the first thing she does, which in my opinion was the smart thing, she called animal control. But the guy at animal control tells her, you need to go out and pull that container off the skunk's head. And she says, no, I don't want to do that. What if I get sprayed? But it comes down to the point where he tells her the only thing that we can do is you go out and take the container off the skunk's head or the skunk's going to stay stuck. She hangs up the phone, she looks out her window and the skunk's gone and she thinks, I'm off the hook, it's somebody else's problem. Until just a minute later it's back in her yard and she realizes she's got to do something to help this. So she walks out in her backyard and very carefully reaches down and pulls the yogurt container off the skunk's head. And amazingly, she doesn't get sprayed. They're eye to eye for a minute, and the skunk just turns and walks away. And now, as a reminder that sometimes when you see a problem, you're the one that needs to do something about it, she has an old yellow yogurt container on her desk as a pencil holder. That's a good reminder for us, isn't it? That sometimes we need to step up and do something. A story out of Scripture that is very tied to this as well is the story of the Good Samaritan. We've been talking about the prodigal son, which is probably Jesus' most well-known parable. Well, the Good Samaritan is probably the second most well-known. And in that story, Jesus tells of a man that was beaten and robbed on the roadside, laying there half dead, and a priest comes walking by, and everybody in the story, or that's hearing the story, thinks, oh, well, the priest will take care of it. But what's he do? He steps over to the other side of the road and walks on. And then a Levite comes by and does the same thing. And then a Samaritan, who the Jews think are lower than the lowest on the earth because they're half-breeds. They married other people around instead of staying true to their Jewish roots. They would never be the hero of a story. The Samaritan walks up and takes care of the man's wounds, bandages him, takes him to an inn, pays for his medical care, and says, if anything else needs to be done, do it, and I'll come back and pay for it later after I finish my business trip. The lowest of the low, the person that nobody would expect to step up and do something, is the hero of the story because he saw a need that he could take care of, and he took care of it. See, we're talking about the last action step of aha this morning. We've seen that the son woke up. We've seen him wake up. He realizes where he's at, that he's in a dirty pig pen, and he's brutally honest with himself that he is the cause of himself being in the pig pen. But if he just stops there, aha doesn't happen. The third step determines if it's just a sad story or if it's the fulfillment of an aha story. So we're going to look at, to begin with this morning, Luke 15, 17 through 20a, the first half of 20. It says, when he came to his senses, he said, sudden awakening, how many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food, and here I am dying of hunger? I'll get up, go to my father, and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers. Brutal honesty. And then the first half of 20. So he got up and went to his father's house. He had a sudden awakening. He came to his senses. He had to be brutally honest with himself about the consequences that he deserved. And now, if he wants to truly have aha, he has to act. Our third ingredient is immediate action. He has to do something. Because unless you act, you won't have aha. Unless you act, it's really just an emotional roller coaster that you're on. Anybody here familiar with Groupon? It's an online shopping app. You know, I use it from time to time. You can get some really good deals. But it's one of those things, if you see a deal and you think, oh, well, I'll get to it later, a lot of times those deals are gone. You have to act almost immediately. In fact, I just bought a laptop for probably 65% off the original retail price because I got a Groupon deal on it. But if I'd waited, that price goes away and you're stuck with the full price if you decide to still do it. That's the thing. Unless you act, you won't have aha. Not really, anyway. We said last week how hard brutal honesty is, how it is so hard to be honest with yourself. And while that's true, I truly believe that this immediate action is the hardest of the three ingredients to get. Brutal honesty is hard, but translating that into action is one of the most difficult things you can ever do in your life sometimes. Think about it this way. We just passed Thanksgiving. Have you stepped on the scales the day after Thanksgiving and you see a number you really don't like? But a lot of times it takes until January 1st before you decide to do anything about it. And even then, if you do something about it, it may only last for about a month and then that goes away. I'm hoping that's not the case for us because we just joined a gym a couple of days ago, and I'm hoping we take it a lot more serious than that. But the hardest part of but the prodigal son in Luke 15, he realizes that he can't stay where he is. And Luke 15:20 says that he got up. He got up and went to his father. And the he got up part is actually just one Greek word. And what's interesting is that same Greek word is what we translate into the word resurrection. Think about that for a minute. It literally just means to get up. But you have to wonder, and I really do wonder, if when Jesus was telling this story, if he had a little more in mind than just getting up. You see, the prodigal son didn't just stand up and start walking. He got up out of something bigger than just a pig pen. He got up and he started a new life. Getting up can change everything. Getting up can be the difference between divorce and mending your marriage. Getting up can be the difference between struggling with an ongoing addiction and freedom. Getting up is the difference between giving in to peer pressure and staying away from that stuff that you swore you would never get into. Getting up is the difference between continuing to feel alone and forgiving that grudge that you've held on to for far too long. Getting up is the difference between just going through the motions in your relationship with Jesus and truly living that relationship out. So my question is this: what does it take to get up? Because unless you act, you won't have aha. And I think in order to get up, you have to know three things. And we see these three things in the story. First, you have to know where you are. Just like the son had to be brutally honest about his situation, he has to understand that staying there is unacceptable. Aha takes an understanding of what life can be. Aha takes an understanding of the power of God. Because if you don't know or you don't believe that God truly has something better for your life than sitting in a pig pen, why would you get up? You know, when a kid's a senior in high school, they just want to do anything, just about anything they can to get out of the house. Get out of high school, go to college, or move on with their life. And that's because they know no matter how good it's been to be at home for the past 18 years with everything provided for them, home-cooked meals, mom doing the laundry, etc., they know that it's just time to leave. They can't always say why, but they just know. There's something in them that just says, being here is not okay anymore. I have to get out. And that's what it takes to get up. You have to go beyond honesty. Here I am starving to death. And realize that you don't have to starve to death anymore. When you realize, again, that you don't have to starve to death anymore, when you know where you are and you know that you don't have to stay there, it makes it possible to get up. For me, in my story, my aha story, that was realizing that I didn't just have to half-heartedly go through the motions of my relationship with Christ anymore. That He could and He would forgive me for that. And that all I needed to do is take that first step and start working on my relationship with Him again. The second thing that you have to know is where you're going. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that you have to have all the answers, but I am saying that you have to know which direction you're going. And when you know which direction you're going, it makes it a whole lot easier. If you know which direction you're going, it makes things a whole lot easier. When the prodigal son got up, he knew where he was going. He was going back to his father's house. But I truly doubt that he knew exactly how long that journey would take him. or where he was going to lay his head at night, or where his meals were going to come from. But he knew he had to get back to that house. He didn't know how the place might have changed. He didn't know how exactly, or he didn't know if his brother would ever speak to him again. He didn't know exactly what his new way of life would look like. But he knew it would be better than the current one. So he got up. When you have an aha moment, rarely, if ever, will God let you know exactly what's going to happen from there. But if you know where you're going, if you know that what God has in store for you will be better than where you've been, you can get up. It might not be easy. It might be the hardest thing you've ever done. But when God gives you an aha moment, He just wants you to come home. It might mean saying, I don't know if I'll fit in right away at church, but I know that's where I need to be. It might mean saying, I might lose all my friends if I quit partying, but I don't want to live that way anymore. Might mean saying, I don't know if she will ever forgive me, but I know the Bible says to be honest. It might mean saying forgiving my mom might be the hardest thing I've ever done, but I know that I need to forgive others the way Jesus forgives me. For me, it was saying I don't know exactly what living on fire for God looks like in my life, but I know that's exactly what I need to be doing. You see, when you can see past the present into the future God has for you, it makes immediate action possible. And when you know where you're going, when you know the end goal, it makes it possible to get up. Third, you have to know who's waiting for you. We're going to look back at our story out of Luke 15:20. I'm going to begin at the beginning of 20 and read through 24. It says, So he got up and went to his father's house. But while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father told his servants, Quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then bring the fattened calf and slaughter it. And let's celebrate with a feast. Because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. This son would have obviously have known his father, but there is no way that he could have expected his father to react like this. Where's the father's anger? Where's the son's punishment? There's none of that in this story. There's only a celebration. Even before the son got all the way there, the father was running to greet him. And you have to understand that this was not normal in this culture. In order for him to run, he would have had to hike up his garment, or else he would have been dragging it through the dirt. And for a father, for a grown man to do that, especially for a son that was so disrespectful, it would have been unheard of in this culture. Men did not run. This would have been complete indignity for the father. But he throws social customs and taboos out the window, and he runs to hug his son. No one listening to Jesus tell this story could have ever predicted this. And that's exactly why Jesus told this story. Now we can predict it. Now we know who is waiting on us. Jesus tells us about a father who waits patiently, who waits eagerly for us to return to Him. Jesus tells us about a father who would do anything to see us back in His house. Jesus tells us about a father who would suffer unimaginably while He waits for His children to come home. And now we know who's waiting for us. Aha begins with us, but it ends with God. when we take our life, when we take our money and we go off to a distant country, God lets go. He lets us make the decision to leave. He lets us make the decision to abandon our family, to treat people unfairly, to throw our lives away in sin, to pursue our own selfish desires, to try to fill up the emptiness of our lives with drugs or porn or anger or work or sports or TV or video games. He allows us to do that. It starts with us. But when we say, I've had enough, when we say, I don't want to starve to death anymore, I don't have to starve to death anymore, I'm going home, then it all ends with God running out to meet us. That's what it takes to get up. No matter how far off that distant country was, God sits on the front porch, staring off into the distance, waiting. He doesn't give up. He doesn't get tired of waiting. He doesn't go inside. He waits. And when you move beyond a sudden awakening and beyond brutal honesty, and you go home, He runs to meet you. And when you know who's waiting for you, it makes it possible to get up and take that first step. For me, it looked like this when I made my aha moment, when I realized where I was, when I had that sudden awakening and I was brutally honest with myself. My immediate action, I was in Bible college at the time. I had a single dorm room. I was the only one in that room. And it was right before the semester started, didn't have classes yet. So one day I locked myself in my room. I didn't see a single person that whole day. I spent the day in prayer, in Bible reading, in meditating with God, and just spending the whole day with Him. That's what it took for me to take that first step back towards God, and He came running. Now, it took me a few years to get back to where I was before I walked away. But I knew who was waiting for me on the other side. This, for me, was my aha story, my rebirth, my resurrection from not actually living fully for Christ. This was the beginning of the cross-eyed Jesus freak that I talk about. This moment was the beginning of cross-eyed Jesus freak, trying to live fully, completely for Him my whole life. It can kind of look like this. There is no way that you can go too far from the love of God. Watch this video and then I'll wrap up.
Angela? Hon, you've got to get back out there. He's going to kill you, please.
I can't.
What are you doing? We got 2 minutes.
I'm done. I'm going home to my dad.
Angela, please.
You get back in there. You get back in there. Look at you. Look at you! Think you're gonna go home to your dad? Does he know what you are? I know what you are. You're trash. You take your clothes off for money. You're a junkie, Angela. You are. You'll sell anything. You'll do anything for that next hit, won't you? Yeah, I know about that. Yeah. So when you go home to Daddy and he slams a door in your face, don't come crawling back to me.
She walked away to start trying to make money for med school and ended up taking her clothes off for money, ended up an addict. But she made the decision there at the end to come back to her father, to walk away, to come back home. If you've walked away from God, all He's asking is for you to come back. All He's asking is for you to take that first step. any decision you need to make this morning, now's the time to do so as we sing number 292, Thou Didst Leave Thy Throne. We're going to sing 1 and 5.